Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own life? You wake up, you work, you go to sleep, but nothing ever changes. You see the world moving fast, people climbing mountains of success, while you are still stuck in the valley of tomorrow. This is your reality check. Today, on Audiobook English Stories, we begin the story of Elias, a man who lost everything, but found something that no money can buy. The rain in the city was cold and relentless. Elias stood on a busy street corner, his old coat soaked to the bone. He was 30 years old, but his eyes looked much older. In his pocket, he felt a thin wallet almost empty, but in his heart, he felt an even heavier weight, the weight of 10 years wasted. Across the street, a bright neon sign flashed. It was the grand opening of a luxury watch boutique. Elias watched as a black car pulled up, and a man stepped out in a suit that cost more than Elias made in a year. It was Julian, an old friend from school. Back then, Elias was the one with the talent. He could fix any clock with his eyes closed. But Julian had discipline, while Elias only had excuses. As Julian walked into the building, surrounded by cameras and applause, he didn't even notice the man standing in the rain. To the world, Julian was a giant. To the world, Elias was invisible. Elias looked at his hands stained with oil and rough from low-paying repair work. He realized a terrifying truth. Time is running out. You are staying still. His shoulders were heavy under the weight of the world. But his feet did not stop. He knew that if he died tonight, no one would remember his name. Mediocrity does not kill you quickly. It sucks your soul out day by day. Is this it? He whispered into the wind. Is this the end of my story? The pain was finally greater than the comfort. The shame was finally louder than the excuses. Elias began to walk. He walked until he reached the rusted door of his basement workshop. He went inside and turned on a single, flickering light bulb. The room smelled of dust and regret. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror. The man looking back was tired. The man looking back was a loser. No more, Elias said. The words were quiet, but they felt like thunder. No more excuses. No more tomorrow. No more being invisible. He grabbed a wooden board and nailed it across the only window. He didn't want to see the world anymore. He wanted to build something so great that the world would have to come knocking on his door. The most dangerous place in the world is a comfortable bed where nothing happens. Elias was ready to disappear. He was ready to do the invisible work. Most people want the trophy, but nobody wants the training. Most people want the light, but nobody wants the basement. He took a deep breath. He was about to enter the darkness for a very long time. If you feel stuck like Elias, it is time to wake up. Subscribe to Audiobook English Stories now to join his journey of awakening and change your own life. Leave a comment saying I am ready if you are brave enough to face your reality today. Mini cliffhanger. Elias has locked himself away. But will he have the strength to stay in the dark when the silence becomes unbearable? To change your future, you must first understand the chains of your past. What is the root of your struggle? For Elias, The shadows of his childhood were the walls of his prison. He sat in his dark basement, the smell of old oil and dust filling his lungs. And he remembered. He remembered the boy. He used to be a boy with big dreams and a heart full of hope. But hope is a fragile thing when it is met with cold words. Elias closed his eyes and could still hear his father's voice, sharp and heavy like a hammer. "Stop dreaming, Elias," his father would say. "People like us don't become masters. People like us just survive. Get a real job. Stop wasting time with those useless gears and springs." Every time Elias tried to create something beautiful, those words tore it down. He grew up believing that he was not enough. He became a man who was afraid of his own potential. This is the ghost of the past that haunts so many of us. We carry the criticisms of people who were too afraid to dream themselves. Elias had spent 30 years trying to prove his father wrong. But in doing so, he had proven him right by never finishing anything. He was paralyzed by the fear of failure. So he chose the safety of never truly trying. Your past is a lesson, not a life sentence. Elias whispered to the empty room. He realized that his father's voice had become his own inner voice. He was the one telling himself to quit. He was the one choosing to stay small. The root of his struggle was not the lack of money or the lack of tools. It was the lack of belief. He had been a prisoner of his own mind for 10 long years. In the silence of the basement, Elias looked at a faded photograph of himself as a child, holding a small wooden clock. The boy in the photo was smiling. The boy in the photo believed he could capture time itself. Elias felt a deep ache in his chest, a mourning for the person he was supposed to be. He realized that if he didn't break these chains now, he would carry them to his grave. He stood up and walked to his workbench. He picked up a rusted file and began to clean it. The sound of metal on metal was the first step toward freedom. He wasn't just cleaning a tool, he was cleaning his soul. He was deciding that the opinions of others were no longer his reality. "I am not my past," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I am not the names they called me. I am not the failures I have faced." This is the hardest part of the journey, to look at the root of your pain and decide to pull it out. It hurts to let go of the excuses that have protected you for so long. But you cannot build a skyscraper on a foundation of sand and regret. Elias spent the entire night sorting through his old drawings, the ones he had hidden away because he thought they were useless. He realized his talent was still there, waiting under the dust of doubt. He had the skill, but he lacked the spirit. The root was deep, and the struggle was real. But the fire was finally lit. If you are listening to this, ask yourself, what is keeping you in the dark? Whose voice are you listening to, yours, or the ghosts of those who doubted you? It is time to stop being a victim of your history and start being the architect of your future. Mini cliffhanger. Elias has identified the enemy within. But a sudden tragedy is about to test if his new resolve is made of iron or just glass. Can he survive the ultimate injustice? Every transformation begins with a fire. And for Elias, that fire was lit by the coldest of hands. It was a Thursday morning, the kind of gray, lifeless day that feels like a warning. Elias was at his small repair shop. working on a cheap plastic watch for a customer who didn't even say thank you. Suddenly, the door swung open, and two men in suits walked in. They weren't there to fix a clock. They were there to take his world away. You're 3 months behind on the rent. Elias, the taller man said, tossing a red folder onto the dusty counter. The owner is selling the building. You have 48 hours to pack your things and leave. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. This shop, as broken and poor as it was his only sanctuary. Please, he whispered, his voice trembling. I just need a little more time. I have a project, a masterpiece I'm working on. The man laughed, a sound that cut deeper than any blade. A masterpiece. Look at this place. Elias, you're a failure living in a basement, surrounded by junk. You're not a master. You're a ghost. Nobody cares about your masterpiece because nobody cares about you. He was humiliated in front of the only world he knew. As they walked out, one of the men kicked a box of gears. Elias had spent months sorting, scattering his dreams across the dirty floor. This was his breaking point. It was the moment where the vessels of his old life finally shattered beyond repair. He sat on the floor, surrounded by the scattered pieces of metal, and for the first time in years, he didn't cry. He felt a cold, hard anger rising from his stomach. He realized that the world would never give him a chance. He had to take it. The injustice of being treated like trash because he was poor and unknown became the fuel for his new engine. Don't get mad. Get better, he muttered to himself, repeating the words until they became a heartbeat. He looked at the red folder and then at his scarred hands. He realized that being pushed to the edge was actually a gift. When you have nothing left to lose, you are finally free to risk everything. He spent the next 48 hours not in despair, but in a frenzy of focused action. He packed only his best tools and his most sacred drawings. He left the furniture, the trash, and the memories of his failures behind. He moved his life into the smallest, the darkest corner of his apartment, a space no bigger than a closet, and he vowed that he would not come out until the world was forced to see him. This is the point of no return. This is where most people quit because the pain is too high. But Elias knew that if he didn't change now, he would be a ghost forever. The great injustice had broken his heart, but it had finally opened his eyes. If you are feeling the weight of an unfair world today, remember Elias. Use that anger. Use that pain. Let your breaking point be the place where your greatness begins. Mini cliffhanger. Elias has lost his shop and his dignity, but he has found a dangerous new level of focus. Can he survive the first week of total isolation? Or will the silence drive him back to the safety of his old, broken life? The first night in the small, the dark corner of his apartment was the quietest night Elias had ever known. There were no ticking clocks to fix, no customers complaining, and no city noise reaching his new sanctuary. He sat on a cold wooden chair, staring at the blank wall. The silence was not peaceful. It was a mirror. It reflected every doubt he had ever tried to drown with busy work. In the darkness, his inner voice began to speak, and it was not kind. What are you doing? Elias, it whispered. You are 30 years old, and you are sitting in a closet with a pile of scrap metal. You could just go back. You could apologize to the landlord. You could find a simple job and live a quiet, invisible life. This is the moment of the great choice. We all have two voices inside us. The voice of the victim, which wants to stay safe, and the voice of the victor, which wants to grow. For hours, Elias wrestled with himself. He felt the urge to turn on the television, to check his phone, or to find any distraction to stop the pain of thinking. But he stayed in the chair. He asked himself one big, terrifying question. If not now, when? If he didn't change at his lowest point, he would never change. He realized that the safety of his old life was actually a slow death. He saw that his fear of failure was actually a fear of his own greatness. Suddenly, the voice of the victor grew louder. It didn't promise him money or fame. It promised him respect, the respect of the man in the mirror. Elias reached out in the dark and grabbed his smartphone. He didn't open social media. Instead, he deleted every app that wasted his time. He blocked the numbers of the friends who only called him to complain. This was his first act of war against his old self. He made a silent vow to the darkness. I will not come out of this room until I am a different man, he whispered. He wasn't just fixing watches anymore. He was fixing his soul. The transition from resignation to change is the most painful step a human can take. It requires you to kill the person you used to be so the person you want to become can be born. Elias picked up his pen and wrote one word on the wall in front of him. Relentless. If you are listening to this in the middle of your own dark night, do not run from the silence. Let it speak to you. Ask yourself the same question Elias did. If you don't start today, will you ever start at all? Mini cliffhanger. The vow has been made. But the world doesn't care about vows. It only cares about results. Is Elias ready to face the physical pain of his new, brutal routine? The sun rose on the first day of Elias's new life. But he did not see it. He had nailed the boards over his window for a reason. He was leaving the world behind. This was his hard departure, the painful process of cutting ties with everything that kept him small. He spent the morning packing his few remaining clothes into a single bag. He looked at his old phone one last time. There were messages from friends asking him to come to a bar, to waste another night, to complain about the government, and to talk about dreams they would never chase. With a steady hand, Elias turned the phone off and placed it in a drawer. To reach a place where others cannot reach, you must do what others will not do. Leaving your comfort zone is not a single step. It is a series of quiet, lonely deaths. You must kill the part of you that craves approval. You must kill the part of you that fears the silence. Elias felt a wave of cold terror as he realized he was now truly alone. There was no one to blame if he failed. There was no audience to clap if he succeeded. He walked to his workbench and laid out his tools like a soldier preparing for battle. His departure was not a physical journey to a new city, but a mental journey to a new identity. He was no longer Elias the repairman. He was now a man obsessed with a single, impossible goal. The fear of the unknown began to scream in his ears. What if you spend 10 years and fail? The voice whispered. What if the world forgets you completely? Elias gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. Then, I will die a man who tried. He answered back. This is the hardest departure of all, leaving the person you were told to be. It is the moment you stop waiting for permission to be great. Elias took his watch off his wrist, the very watch he had used to track his wasted hours, and he smashed it with a hammer. He didn't need to track time anymore. He was now living in the invisible work where time does not exist, only results. If you are listening to this, what are you willing to leave behind? You cannot fly if you are still holding on to the weights of your old life. Mini cliffhanger. The door is locked. The world is gone. And the tools are ready. But as the clock strikes midnight, Elias realizes that his body is much weaker than his mind. Will his physical strength fail before his work even begins? The motivation that started Elias's journey was a spark. But sparks do not last. To survive the darkness, he needed a furnace. This was the beginning of his discipline phase, the stage where dreams are either forged into reality or ground into dust by the weight of repetition. Every morning, the alarm screamed at 4:00 a.m. There was no sun to greet him. Only the cold, gray light of his single bulb. His body ached. His eyes burned. The comfortable bed he once loved felt like a trap. But Elias did not negotiate with his feelings. He stood up, splashed ice-cold water on his face, and sat at his bench. Discipline is the bridge between goals and accomplishment. For 14 hours a day, the world consisted of nothing but microscopic gears and the sound of his own breathing. He was polishing a single bridge of a watch movement for 3 days. To an outsider, it looked like madness. To Elias, it was the price of greatness. He failed 100 times. A spring would fly across the room, or a jewel would crack under too much pressure. In the past, he would have thrown his tools in anger. Now, he simply stood up, picked up the piece, and started again. He learned that excellence is not an act, but a habit. It is what you do when you are tired. It is what you do when nobody is watching. His hands began to move with a strange, robotic precision. He stopped eating for pleasure. He ate for fuel. He stopped sleeping for rest. He slept for recovery. The repetition was boring. It was exhausting. It was lonely. But inside that boredom, something miraculous was happening. The invisible work was changing his brain. He was no longer a man who tried to work. He was a man who was the work. He was building a masterpiece. But the masterpiece was also building him. Wake up. Work. Repeat. Never stop. The days bled into weeks, and the weeks into months. His skin grew pale from the lack of sunlight, but his eyes grew sharper. He was becoming a master of the small things. He realized that if you can control your mornings, you can control your life. If you can control a tiny screw, you can control your destiny. If you are listening to this, remember, you don't need more inspiration. You need more discipline. You need to do the work when it is boring, when it hurts, and when you feel like nothing is changing. Mini cliffhanger. The routine is set, and the progress is steady. But as Elias reaches the 2-year mark, a letter is slid under his door. A letter that threatens to pull him back into the world he worked so hard to leave. The 2-year mark is where the honeymoon of hard work ends, and the reality of the long road begins. Elias had reached the wall, that invisible barrier where your mind screams at you to stop, and your body begs to return to the way things were. His eyes were constantly bloodshot from staring through a magnifying loupe, and his fingers were permanently stained with fine oil. The isolation was no longer a novelty. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. One rainy evening, a letter was slid under his door. It was from Julian, the man in the expensive suit from the boutique opening. The letter was an invitation to a high society gala, but it was also a taunt. It read, "Elias, I heard you disappeared. Come to the gala. I have a position for a repairman in my firm. Stop hiding in the dark. You were never meant for greatness. You were meant to serve it." The temptation was a physical weight. Julian was offering him a salary, a title, and a way out of the suffocating silence of the basement. Elias looked at his unfinished masterpiece on the bench, thousands of tiny, nameless parts that still didn't tell time. He felt a wave of crushing doubt. Maybe he's right. The victim's voice whispered in his ear. Maybe you are just a repairman playing God. You could have a warm bed and a full stomach tomorrow. This is the wall that every successful person must climb. It is the pressure from the world that says you will never make it. Elias stood up, his legs shaking from sitting for 14 hours. He walked to the door and picked up the letter. He looked at the fancy gold ink and the expensive paper. Then, he looked at the wall where he had written the word relentless. He realized that Julian wasn't offering him a job. He was offering him a cage. If he accepted, he would be safe. But he would be dead inside. The wall isn't there to keep you out. It is there to see how badly you want to get in. The temptation to quit will be greatest just before you succeed. Elias muttered, his voice raspy from disuse. He took the letter, tore it into 100 pieces, and threw it into the trash. He didn't need Julian's light. He was becoming his own son. He sat back down at his bench. His hands were still trembling, but his heart was steady. He picked up his smallest screwdriver and began to work on the escapement wheel. Every turn of the screw was a victory over the temptation to be average. If you are facing your own wall right now, if people are telling you to give up and take the easy path, remember that the wall is the final test of your character. Mini cliffhanger. Elias has conquered the temptation. But as he pushes deeper into the 3rd year, his resources are running out. He has no money left for food. How can a man build a masterpiece when he can barely afford to breathe? There is a moment in every long journey where the darkness begins to thin, and the first ray of light breaks through the clouds. For Elias, this was the year of small wins. He was penniless. His stomach was often empty, and his hands were calloused. But his spirit was beginning to roar. One Tuesday night, after 3 years of invisible work, Elias finally assembled the heartbeat of his masterpiece, the balance wheel. He held his breath as he placed the tiny, golden wheel into the movement. He nudged it gently with a fine needle. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It wasn't just the sound of a machine. It was the sound of his discipline becoming a physical reality. He realized that small progress is still progress. For the first time in 1,000 days, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. He wasn't just a man in a basement anymore. He was a creator. You have potential, he whispered to himself, his eyes reflecting the steady rhythm of the wheel. This small victory changed his mindset. He no longer worked out of fear of failure. He worked out of a hunger for excellence. He found a way to survive by fixing a few old clocks for a local antique dealer in exchange for bread and oil. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the fire burning. These small wins are the fuel you need to cross the desert. They remind you that the plan is working, even when the world cannot see it yet. Elias felt a surge of momentum. He began to work faster, his movements more confident, his focus sharper than ever before. He realized that he didn't need the grand gala or Julian's approval. He had the truth in front of him, ticking steadily in the dark. He was becoming a master of his craft, 1 second at a time. If you are struggling today, look for your small win. Did you wake up on time? Did you finish one page? Did you say no to a distraction? Celebrate it. Those tiny sparks are the only way to start a massive fire. Mini cliffhanger. The masterpiece is finally coming together. But nature is about to bring a challenge that no amount of discipline can prepare for. Is Elias ready to protect his life's work against a force he cannot control? The 9th year of the invisible work brought the storm that Elias never saw coming. It was a night when the sky turned a bruised purple. And the rain did not just fall. It attacked. In his small basement sanctuary, Elias heard a sound that made his blood turn to ice, the sound of rushing water. A pipe had burst under the pressure of the storm, and muddy water began to pour into his workshop. This was the dark night of the soul. The moment where everything he had built for nearly a decade was inches away from being destroyed. Elias stood in the rising water, his body freezing, but his heart was a furnace of panic and determination. He didn't think about his own safety. He thought about the masterpiece on his bench. He grabbed the delicate movement, the thousands of tiny gears he had polished with his own sweat, and held it high above his head. "Not today," he screamed into the darkness, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "You will not take this from me." He stood there for hours, his legs cramping in the cold flood, his arms shaking under the weight of his only hope. He was alone, in the dark, fighting a battle that no one would ever see. This is the ultimate test. Will you keep going when it feels like the universe itself wants you to fail? He felt the temptation to just let go, to let the water take it all, and finally sleep. But he remembered the face of the man in the mirror 9 years ago, the man who was tired of being a loser. If you are going through hell, keep going. The water eventually stopped rising, but the damage was done. Elias sat in the mud, holding his masterpiece, shivering uncontrollably. He was at his lowest point, standing on the thin line between giving up and starting over. If you are in your own dark night right now, if you feel like the flood is rising and you cannot breathe, do not let go. The darkness is not there to drown you. It is there to see if you are truly ready for the light. Mini cliffhanger. Elias is broken, wet, and exhausted. Sitting among the ruins of his workshop, does he have one more ounce of strength to stand up? Or is this where the invisible work ends in silence? The morning after the flood was the quietest morning of Elias's life. He sat in the mud, his clothes soaked and his body shivering. But something had changed inside him. He looked at his masterpiece, still safe in his hands. And then he looked at the wreckage of his workshop. For the first time in 10 years, he didn't feel fear. He felt an explosive sense of power. This was his resurrection. Most people think strength comes from winning. But Elias realized that true strength comes from the choice to stand up when you have every reason to stay down. He stood up, his legs heavy and cramped, and he began to clean. He didn't complain to the universe. He didn't ask, "Why me?" He simply picked up a cloth and began to dry his tools. A warrior is not someone who always wins, but someone who always fights. Elias realized that the flood hadn't destroyed his work. It had tested his mindset. The water could wash away his furniture, but it could not wash away the 10 years of discipline he had built inside his soul. He looked at the wall where he had written "relentless," and the words seemed to glow in the morning light. "I am not finished," he whispered, his voice like iron. "I am just starting." He spent the next 3 months working with a speed and precision he had never known. It was as if the fire of the disaster had melted away his last remaining doubts. He wasn't just assembling a clock. He was finishing his own transformation. Every gear he placed was a statement of his existence. He was no longer a ghost. He was a creator rising from the ashes. If you have experienced a disaster in your life, if you have lost your workshop or your hope, remember, Elias, the destruction is often the preparation for your greatest rise. Your resurrection begins the moment you decide that you are not done yet. Mini cliffhanger. The masterpiece is complete, and the doors of the basement are finally about to open. But after 10 years in the dark, is Elias ready for the blinding light of the world's judgment? The day finally arrived. After 10 years in the shadows, Elias stepped out of his basement and into the blinding light of the world. He was carrying a small wooden box, and inside it was the result of 650 days of invisible work. He walked toward the grand hall where the International Horology Exhibition was being held. The same place where Julian's name was once the only one that mattered. When Elias entered the hall, no one looked at him. He looked like a common laborer with his scarred hands and simple clothes. He approached the center table, where the most famous masters in the world were judging the year's greatest creations. With a steady hand, he opened his box and placed his masterpiece on the velvet cloth. The room went silent. Julian was there, laughing with a group of investors, until he saw the movement of Elias's clock. He stopped mid-sentence. The judges leaned in, their magnifying glasses trembling. What they saw was not just a clock. It was a miracle of engineering. Every gear was polished to a mirror finish, and the mechanism moved with a soul-stirring rhythm that seemed to defy gravity. "Who are you?" the head judge whispered, his voice full of awe. I am a man who worked in the dark, Elias replied, his voice calm and powerful. This was his grand victory. It wasn't just about the gold medal they placed around his neck or the cameras that began to flash. It was the moment he realized that success loves silence. Let your work be your noise. He looked at Julian, who could not even meet his eyes. The man who had mocked him was now small, while the man who had suffered in silence was a giant. The victory was not just material, it was the ultimate freedom of the soul. He had proven that discipline beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. He had turned his breaking point into his starting point. The world finally knew his name. But more importantly, he finally knew his own worth. If you are working in the dark right now, if you feel like no one sees your effort, keep going. Your grand victory is not a matter of if, but when. Build your masterpiece in silence and let the results roar. Mini cliffhanger. And fame is knocking at his door. But as the crowds cheer, Elias realizes that his journey is not about the applause. What will he do with his new identity? The applause eventually faded, and the bright lights of the exhibition hall were replaced by the soft, natural glow of a new morning. Elias stood on the balcony of his new workshop. But he was no longer the man who lived in fear of the shadows. This was his new identity, a self forged, not by the praise of the world, but by the fire of his own discipline. He looked at his hands. They were still scarred, and his nails were still stained with the oil of his craft. But he no longer hid them in his pockets. These hands were his medals. They were the proof that he had survived the invisible work and come out stronger on the other side. He realized that the greatest prize was not the gold medal sitting on his desk. The prize was the man he had become during those 10 years of silence. The prize is not the trophy. The prize is the man you become. His perspective on the world had shifted forever. He no longer saw obstacles as enemies. He saw them as teachers. When a spring broke or a design failed, he didn't feel the old sting of not being enough. He simply smiled and started again, knowing that every failure was just another step toward a higher level of mastery. He moved with a new sense of calm authority, a quiet power that only comes to those who have conquered themselves. People now came from all over the world to see him. They offered him millions for his time and his name. But Elias remained unchanged. He lived simply, worked deeply, and protected his focus like a sacred treasure. He was no longer a slave to the tomorrow that never comes. He was the master of the present moment. If you are listening to this, understand that your goal is not just to have success, but to be a person capable of success. You must change your identity before you can change your life. Stop asking for things to be easier, and start asking for yourself to be better. Mini cliffhanger. Elias has reached the peak of personal mastery. But he knows that true greatness is not found in standing alone at the top. What will he do to ensure his 10 years of struggle serve a purpose beyond himself? The final chapter of a great life is not written in gold or stone, but in the hearts of those who follow the path. Elias did not use his fame to build a palace. He used it to build a bridge. He opened a small, quiet school in the same neighborhood where he once struggled. But this was no ordinary school. There were no loud bells or crowded classrooms, only the steady, sacred sound of ticking clocks and the focused breathing of students. He taught them that the invisible work is the only work that lasts. He showed them his old, scarred workbench and told them stories of the flood, the hunger, and the silence. Your greatest masterpiece is not what you make, he would tell them, his voice calm and full of authority. It is the character you forge when no one is watching. This was his legacy. He realized that his 10 years in the dark were not a punishment, but a preparation for a higher purpose. He had become a motivation mentor, a living proof that a normal person can achieve the extraordinary through relentless discipline. He looked at the young faces in his workshop, the dreamers who were often told they were not enough, and he gave them the permission to believe in themselves. Be patient in the dark. Be humble in the light, he whispered as he handed his oldest, most trusted file to a young student who reminded him of himself. Elias had found the ultimate wisdom. Success is not a destination you reach. It is a way of walking through the world. He was no longer chasing time. He was at peace with it. He stood by the window, the same window he had once nailed shut, and looked out at the city. He didn't see enemies or rivals anymore. He saw thousands of people, each carrying a hidden seed of greatness that only needed the water of discipline to grow. His journey from a broken repairman to a legendary master was complete. But his wisdom would live forever in the gears of every clock his students made. If you are listening to this, understand that your struggle is your strength. Your silence is your power. The wisdom of Elias is now yours to carry. Mini cliffhanger. The story of Elias has reached its end, but your story is just beginning. Are you ready to hear the final call to action that will change your life today? The story of Elias is over, but yours is just beginning. You have followed his 10-year journey through the darkness, the flood, and the silence. Now, the energy of his transformation must become your own. It is time to stop being a spectator of other people's success and start being the architect of your own destiny. Let's recap the mindset vocabulary that paved Elias's road to greatness. Discipline, the bridge between your current reality and your ultimate goals. Relentless, the refusal to stop when the world tells you no word. Invisible work, the deep, focused effort you put in when no one is watching. Resurrection, the power to stand up after your greatest failure and try again. Elias didn't become a master because he was lucky. He became a master because he chose to face his reality check and endure the hard departure from his comfort zone. He traded the temporary pleasure of a comfortable bed for the eternal pride of a masterpiece. He proved that your past is not a life sentence, but a lesson that prepares you for the light. Now, look at your own life. What is the invisible work you have been avoiding? What is the dream you have buried under a mountain of excuses? The clock is ticking, and every second you wait is a second you lose. It is your turn to write your own story. Don't wait for the perfect moment. The perfect moment is a myth. Start in the dark. Start with the pain. Start today. Go to your basement. Lock the door to distractions. And stay there until you become the person you were meant to be. If you are ready to commit to your own transformation, if you are ready to do the work that others will not do, then join our community. Subscribe to Audiobook English Stories and let these lessons of iron will sink deep into your subconscious. Leave a comment right now with your commitment. I am relentless. Write it to tell the world that you are no longer a ghost. Write it to promise yourself that you will never give up. The world is waiting for your masterpiece. Go out there and build it.